Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Tapia. I'm the VP for Counseling for HS2 Academy. All right, so today's topic is I'll be going through admissions trends based on our analysis of like various case studies of this past or this current group of seniors who are now just about to graduate. So hopefully this should be fairly enlightening, especially if you're a current junior. I think this will help you get a very good understanding of like what the most current trends are. But I think it can also very well help younger students in terms of at least getting a head start in terms of like seeing what colleges are looking for these days, what's really important, and what you should prioritize. Okay. Toward the end, we'll also be going through specific case studies of some, like specific students that we've worked with where I think there's some important, I guess, lessons to be learned that you could apply for your applications as well. All right, so we do ask that you refrain from recording any information here. We will eventually make a release of video of this stuff. So if you want to be able to kind of like look at the recording, we have that as well. All right, so first, the changing landscape of specifically for selective private colleges. Of course, a lot's changed recently, so we want to go through some of the major changes as well. So first of all, as many of you are probably aware now, the vast majority of selective colleges, we would say approximately 75 to 80%, remain test optional, which means they give you the option of either submitting your SAT or ACT scores or not submitting it, in which case they just evaluate you on your transcript and your activities. However, this is definitely worth paying attention to. Fairly recently, about a month or two ago, MIT announced that they're going to bring back the SAT or ACT requirement for next year because they felt like they weren't getting enough data points to be able to help them make decisions. They also felt like there's some students, for instance, who wouldn't have given or wouldn't have gotten a fair evaluation if they were simply looking at the GPA because the pandemic might have impacted their grades. So they wanted another data point, another chance for them to prove that they're actually fairly competitive students. And they believe the SAT and ACT would give them that chance. Another thing on the horizon, if you've seen some of my previous seminars, is that College Board did announce that in March of 2024, they're going to be changing the SAT to make it a computerized or a computer adaptive version. So our prediction is that since College Board is going through the entire process of making a brand new version of the SAT, we find it highly unlikely that colleges are going to remain test optional and not necessarily want students to take that new test. College Board, as a nonprofit, actually includes these colleges themselves. So the fact that they're going to roll out a new version of the SAT is actually a pretty good indicator that many colleges would most likely require the SAT again in the future. Okay. Another thing that we see is that like the number of applicants continues to rise, but the jump isn't as large as the previous year. I think in large part because a lot of students were a little hesitant to apply. They would want to take a gap year because of the pandemic. So last year we saw a massive increase. This year there's still an increase. It didn't actually go down, but the percent that it increased by is less than it was in previous years. Okay. There is also a trend now of more international applicants applying. So one source basically said that there was about 34% more international students compared to 2020, right? So more like during the beginning of the pandemic. So overall, that's also accounting for the rise because it's not like automatically there's more domestic applicants. So part of this increase is attributed to the number of international applicants, both from Asia and Europe and South and Central America. All right, so according to the Common Application, which is the primary source or primary application system that most students use for private schools, they saw an increase, based on last cycle of about 22% in the total number of applications, which means the number of schools you're applying to, right? But they also saw a 13% in the number of individual applicants. So that's actually a telling point. So that tells you that not only are there more people applying to US colleges, the total number of applications means that per applicant, there's also a slight increase. So the way we interpret that is that when students see the previous years in terms of the lower acceptance rates, they're going to want to apply to more colleges. And so that's another trend that we're seeing is that students will simply apply to even more colleges now to give themselves more shots to be able to get into selective or top colleges. Okay, so this is the most recent data. As you see here, many of the Ivy League schools did see their acceptance rates drop by a little bit, not a substantial amount. The lowest now, of course, is Harvard at 3.19%, right? So that's the lowest across the board. Now, Stanford has not been releasing their acceptance rates of late, but based on our estimates, it's pretty close. Like Harvard and Stanford are now about neck to neck in terms of their acceptance rates overall. Now, there are some interesting data points here, though. A couple of the ones you see here, Princeton and Cornell, didn't officially release theirs, but based on the estimates that we've seen so far, it's probably going to be about the same, although Cornell's is expected to drop based on their previous year's 8.7%. It's estimated to be about 8% now, but the rest of these are official, right, because the colleges did release their data. As you can see, like there are some outliers where, Columbia actually increased slightly, and that's attributable to them actually slightly increasing their size of their incoming class, right? It's not necessarily that they're, all of a sudden just naturally becoming less selective. It's more that they're trying to make a little bit more room, I guess. The biggest drop, however, is for UPenn, right? So Penn actually decreased a fairly substantial amount there, right? Going from 6.2% to about 4.4%. So among the Ivies, they saw the biggest drop, okay? And once again, I think it's largely because as well, there were more applicants to Penn this past year, not necessarily because they're cutting the number of accepted students by a substantial number. Okay. All right, so this trend also seems to be reflected in most other competitive universities that are non-Ivies. So across the board, there are actually some schools that kind of remain the same, right? You're not necessarily seeing massive drop-offs on some of these schools. There's some notable exceptions, like you see Boston College decreased by about 3%, so did WashU St. Louis. But as you can see for many of these selective colleges, it stayed kind of the same, right? So which kind of gives hope for students, right? So it's not necessarily like all these schools are just, across the board dropping in terms of their acceptance rates. So as long as you have a fairly competitive profile, you should still have a pretty decent shot at least one or two of these top schools. Okay, so the key takeaways here is that the drops aren't as much as last year's, but to compensate, some schools have also increased slightly the number of their incoming class sizes. So as a result, you don't necessarily see that massive a drop off as we saw last year. Okay, now the key thing to keep in mind here is that there's also going to be a little bit more sort of like unpredictability with the results. That's one of the key things that we're seeing this year, is that like because test optional policies have given colleges a lot more freedom to be able to select certain students, they're actually now more able to take a chance on certain students because without the SAT or ACT, they can look for students that they feel bring something to the university that wouldn't have otherwise applied if they needed to have an SAT or ACT, right? So you hear a lot of stories, particularly like of underrepresented minorities who are getting into some of these top colleges, even if they had a really low SAT score or ACT score because they simply didn't submit it. So it wasn't really a factor in terms of their evaluation. So you see some cases then of students with sometimes worse numbers getting into dream schools that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten a chance to. So that gives you hope, of course, if let's say, for example, you're a student who has a pretty decent GPA, but your test scores are kind of like your Achilles heel. But conversely, we also see a lot of cases of students who say, for instance, have historically pretty good numbers, like really good SAT scores, really good ACT scores, good GPA, and high number of AP scores, but for one reason or another are getting denied to schools that they otherwise would have normally gotten into. So we see a little bit of this kind of like, polar extremes of, unpredictability going on. Okay, so the UCs, of course, aren't immune to some of these trends. We're going to take a look at some of the things that are going on among the UCs. So first and foremost, the UCs pretty much have committed to remaining test blind indefinitely, right? So they scrapped their plans of having their own UC test by 2025. And another developing trend here is that the Cal State system has also likewise announced that it would follow the UC's lead and just scrap testing altogether as a component, okay? So this is kind of interesting because then you have like a little bit of like opposite camps here, the UCs and the Cal States pretty much committing to going test blind, but certain other schools like MIT choosing to bring back the SAT requirements. So it remains to be seen. We're going to keep a close watch in terms of these trends and we'll continue to advise our students in terms of the best possible way to prepare. So in this case, if you are a very high achieving student, the best case is to still prepare for an SAT or ACT, just to give you the broadest range of options. If you're going to go test blind for the UCs, you still want to have a strong profile in terms of your grades, your activities. But if you still want a shot at top schools, it still makes a lot of sense for you to go ahead and push to have an SAT or ACT score, unless you know that you're really just weak in testing. I would still recommend that you go ahead and still prepare for it until you know for sure that this is something you can rule out. But the benefit, of course, is that many schools have still committed to staying test optional, at least for the next 2, 3, or 4 years, right? So I think Harvard, for instance, is committed to going test optional for at least until about 2025, as far as what they've announced. Okay, so as far as the UCs are concerned, they have also seen a spike in the number of international applications, right? So over the last 2 years, they've seen an increase by 17%, right? So making the total pool even larger, right? So one of the key things that we're seeing as well is that the UCs are using this opportunity for being test blind to now look to try to recruit more students and increase their diversity numbers. So across all the UC campuses, we're seeing, increases by like, 20, 30, 40% in terms of their Hispanic applicants who are getting in, African-American and Native American populations. So it's sort of like, in a way, even if, let's say, for example, schools in the UCs aren't using affirmative action, this sort of gives them a little bit of wiggle room in terms of accepting more students to increase their diversity, okay? So one of the key things, though, is without the SAT or the ACT, the UCs are now looking at a broader range, right? Because instead of the old 14 factors, which had testing as one of the factors, you now have like, the academic stuff, like your GPA and the courses you pick, are still a fairly sizable percentage, but things like your extracurricular profile, your essays, they become even more important. Okay, so if you want to be competitive for the UCs, not only do you really want to focus on grades and sort of supplementing your curriculum, right? So trying to find if you can take like outside college level courses are a great way to make yourself stand out now, right? Making sure you have great activities in terms of volunteering, doing community service stuff, being very involved in leadership in school. Those are really the main things now that we're seeing in terms of students who are getting into these top UCs. Okay, so yes, grades are a factor, but we've seen some really interesting success stories of students getting into the top UCs, even though they might have less than perfect grades, right? So you don't need perfect 4.0 to actually get into places like Berkeley and UCLA. I mean, it helps, don't get me wrong, but there are ways to override that now. So that should give some students hope, even if they didn't start off with like a perfect GPA. Okay, so here are the actual increase in the number of applicants. So as you can see across the board, there's still some, like a pretty sizable increase. Like Berkeley increased by about 14%, so it's catching up a little bit in terms of the number of applicants to UCLA. UCLA, peaked a lot last year. I think the number of applications increased by like almost 30%, if I recall. But this year it's a little bit more modest, but it's still increasing, right? So it's still increased by about 10,000, which is no small number, right? And so the trend we're seeing now, though, is that like at least a small percentage of that is also attributable to the number of international applicants. So across the board, right? So in last year we saw like Merced actually decrease in terms of the number of applications, but this year every single UC campus increased in terms of the number of applications. Okay, some of course more than others. So now the UCs haven't officially announced their acceptance rates yet, but as you can see here, definitely we can project based on the number of applicants and sort of like if you're estimating based on last year's numbers, this is what you would see, right? So if they were to say the same in terms of the number of applicants they accepted, this would be what you would see. So there was a little bit of a concern about Berkeley, I guess, having to decrease the number of accepted students, but at the very last minute, I guess, the governor went ahead and got legislators to put a stay or a hold on that. So they were still able to accept the number that they were originally anticipating. So we're projecting something around the lines of like 12 to 13% is the closest estimate that we're looking at for Berkeley this year. And then UCLA dropping off to a flat 10%. right? So even Merced actually decreased a little bit now compared to previous years because, there's so many more people applying. Okay, so one of the key trends that we're seeing now then is that we're seeing a better success rate, I guess, for early admissions. So some of the trends that we're seeing now is that more and more schools are accepting students in the early round. So this is a trend that has been a couple of years in the making, and it's still going to continue, right? So with the new test optional policies, there are more students now willing to take a stab at the early rounds. And so they feel like, hey, they can give a shot to their dream schools. Another trend that we're seeing, though, is that a greater percentage of students are being accepted in the early rounds more than ever before, right? So ranging from about 43% for Columbia to about 52% for Brown, right? So this is a comparison of like EAED only versus RD only rounds, right? So we're seeing a fairly substantial increase in the number of people who are getting accepted. So and that's actually what's causing this gap between the acceptance rate. So you see the overall acceptance rates dropping pretty precipitously, but the RD rates, which we're going to show later on, aren't necessarily dropping as much as the overall rates. So we're going to take a look at this trend here in a little bit. So as you can see here, for the Ivies and plus MIT, there are a couple of schools here that didn't release theirs, right? So you see like Princeton didn't release theirs and Columbia didn't release theirs. So I just wanted to give you a snapshot here of what's going on with some of the top universities. So as you can see here, there's actually not that much change, right? So, Brown decreased by about like 1%, Dartmouth by about 1%. But interestingly enough, Harvard actually increased by about 0.5%, right? So this is good news if you want to try to really aggressively try to get into the schools that you're looking for in the EA round or ED round, right? So whereas, like as you saw earlier, the schools, for overall are dropping off, the EAD rounds are still remaining, more or less the same, which definitely strategically then means that you should probably, if you have a dream school and you want to commit to it for ED, you should definitely consider going for it in ED. Okay. However, it's not really kind of all that simple. So we'll talk about that later. I'll break down the numbers in terms of what these ED round acceptance rates would be, and then we'll compare that to the RD only rounds. But just to kind of go through a little bit of a primer, I guess, because some of these might be confusing to you in terms of like what's ED or ED2. So early decision basically means you apply early and you're notified early, typically in December. But the main difference here is that the offer is binding, which means if they accept you, they expect you to go, right? You sign an ED agreement saying that you do commit to going. Many more schools now are adding another option called early decision 2. And what this means is that the deadline is about the same as regular decisions. It'll typically be due sometime in January, but it has the same binding rules as early decision. So the boost for ED, many schools don't separate and give you the actual ED2 only acceptance rate. So that would be a great number for us to be able to find if we have it. But unfortunately, a lot of schools haven't released that data. They just show ED overall, including ED1 and 2. But for the schools that have early decision 2, we anticipate that there is still a boost, but not necessarily as substantial as ED1, right? In fact, schools with ED2, the number of accepted students in that round are going to be significantly less than for ED1. Now, many schools will have early action, right? So early action just simply means you apply early and you're notified early, but you can wait until all your regular decision schools are released, right? And this is typically going to be sometime around March or April, right? There are going to be some schools, most notably schools like Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, that have something called single choice or restricted early action, which means it still follows the early action rules where you can wait until your regular decision before you commit, but you can only apply to them. They want a little bit more like exclusivity, I guess you could say. There are also schools that have something called priority admissions. So what this is that like some schools will have an earlier deadline, but they won't necessarily release the decisions as early as EA, right? So it just means that you're sort of showing that you prefer the school or you want to give like added consideration. So if you can make it by an earlier deadline, they will give you a little bit more consideration than people who applied for a later deadline, because you're sort of sending a signal to the school that you kind of, that they're higher up on your list, I suppose you could say. And then finally, there are schools that have something called rolling admissions, which simply means that if you apply within a certain time frame, they can let you know even as early as like 4 to 8 weeks. So theoretically, for these schools to have rolling admissions, as soon as the application is available, as early as like August 1st, you could submit an application and then find out, right? So this year, we actually had some students finding out even as early as like September and early October, which is great, right? Because if you can find out then, even before the EA or ED applications are due, then you can maybe trim down the number of safety schools that you can apply to. So that's another option that maybe you should consider if you want to be able to kind of get word of your early schools much sooner. Okay. All right, so here's a comparison. Now, we don't have the RD only rates yet for some schools. So what I decided to do here is like this is last year's data, but I think it's still fairly instructive, because if you can see the total acceptance rate, and if you separate the RD only rate, which is the percentage of students or the acceptance rate, if you factor only the applicants in the regular decision round, right? Because a lot of schools publish their overall acceptance rates, which can be kind of misleading, because then you're also including the numbers of people who apply for EAED. So for many of these schools, like Harvard, for instance, if you say like, oh, it's about double, right? So if you look at the EAED rate versus the overall acceptance rate, it looks like it's about double. But if you're only looking at the people who applied regular decision, that number is even lower. So when you're actually comparing it, it's actually even more of a stark contrast. So for Harvard, for instance, you have about a 2.8%. Now, once you start to looking at the ED schools, this is where the numbers get kind of crazy, actually, right? Because if you looked at a school like Brown, for instance, Brown, their RD only rate is about 3.5%, not 5.4, which is the overall rate. So if you're comparing that to their EAED rate, it's almost like 5%, right? It's 4.5%. So it's a pretty dramatic increase, okay? However, it's important to note, though, that these pure numbers don't necessarily mean that it's significantly easier to get into the EAED rounds. There are some other factors that you want to consider. So one of the things to keep in mind is that for EAED, many of these top schools will oftentimes recruit certain applicants, like, for athletic recruiting, right? So Ivies aren't allowed to give out scholarships, but they use the EAED rounds to go ahead and recruit students that they would want to play for them, right? And so oftentimes these Ivy League schools will often offer what are called like likely letters, which they can send even before the decision is out, saying, hey, we want you, right? So you're very likely to get in, right? So just to kind of give them a heads up so that they can maybe prefer that school. So I'll give you an example here of like Brown University. So normally every single year, Brown recruits about 200 to about 240 athletes for their various sports teams, right? And many of them, the vast majority of them are recruited in the ED round. In other words, the coaches tell their students, hey, apply early so that you can get a little bit more sort of like preferential consideration. But they will also have maybe another 80 to 100 special cases being recruited for other things like music or their special VIP cases. So those are typically also done during the early round. However, even if you factor in those special cases, let's say in total there's about like 300 or so special cases, Brown recruits normally about like 800 to 900 in the early round. So if you subtract those, this year's 4.58 acceptance rate would probably fall to about 10.2% if you factor in all those special cases, which if you compare to their RD only rate is still pretty substantial, right? You're still looking at something about almost 3 times as much. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. However, it doesn't mean necessarily that just because there's this big gap that it's largely going to make it easier for you if you don't have necessarily good numbers, right? So this does not suggest that, hey, you know what? It's easier, therefore, if I'm not necessarily a competitive student, I can try to squeak in the early round. That's not necessarily true as well, because I think a large part of this higher acceptance rate is simply because of self-selection. There are far more students who aren't necessarily as qualified who just take a shot at it for regular decision, right? So typically what happens here is that for the ED pool, most of the students who are applying are also themselves going to be pretty top students, right? So which means there are fewer unqualified students apply, and this is largely what accounts for then the higher acceptance rate. Okay. Nonetheless, though, if you're a qualified applicant, bottom line, it's still going to help you, right? So typically what we advise here is that early decision or early action works best if you're already a very competitive student, right? Because of the competition, because of the pool is more self-selective. If you're a competitive applicant, yes, it can definitely help you. But if your numbers are significantly lower than the average students who are going to be considered in this early round, it might backfire against you then because you don't look as competitive. Okay. So what we normally advise is that, especially if you struggled with your grades in 11th grade, we often suggest to students not to necessarily be as aggressive for early action, early decision, because by default, many colleges will want to wait until regular decision. They want to see if your grades go up for first semester of 12th grade. So oftentimes, if your grades especially are like on a downward trend where you struggle a little bit in 11th grade, we often suggest maybe just going for some early safety schools, and then your best shot is actually trying to go for regular decision once you've gotten a stronger first semester in 12th grade to help sort of boost up your profile a little bit more. Okay. So we normally suggest that strategically your best chance is going for schools that are in the reach category, because you don't necessarily want to go for a dream or far reach school for EAED, because then if you're not as competitive, like I said, you don't look as good. However, you also don't want to sell yourself short, right? Because if you're being too conservative and you ED to a school that maybe you would have had a good chance to get into for regular decision, then there's also that maybe you would lose the opportunity to find out if you could have gotten into better schools, right? Unless you really, really know for sure that the school is a really good fit. Okay, so oftentimes finding that perfect, the sweet spot for an ED school requires a little bit more knowledge about like which schools you're competitive for, but not necessarily like, a school that is either way out of your range in both ends, right? So either you're too good for the school in terms of your numbers, you're too competitive, or the opposite, you're not as competitive as the rest of the applicant pool for ED. Okay, so one of the questions that we often get these days is that, do you still need standardized tests? So the simple answer is, yeah, it's still a good idea for you to go ahead and have an SAT or ACT, because even though the UCs and the Cal States are now test blind, many selective colleges still, even though they're test optional, there's still a larger percentage of students who are getting accepted that do go ahead and submit these scores, right? So across the board for the most selective schools, we see numbers like anywhere from 65 to 75% of the accepted students going into places like, UPenn, Brown, Columbia, are still submitting SAT scores. Okay, so in a recent WACAC conference that some of our counselors attended, they actually spoke to admissions people who do say, yeah, they do kind of feel more assured or more confident about the decision to accept certain students if they do submit their tests, because it's, they feel like, they're more confident that the students will succeed at their university with those test scores. Okay, so we often say that even though test optional is definitely a viable option for certain students, it tends to work best though for straight A students, because there are a lot of students out there who are otherwise barred from or wouldn't be considered from these schools if they don't have an SAT or ACT score, but that now apply. So that the last couple of years, there are more and more students who are applying with straight A's, because now they can with test optional. So oftentimes, if you're going to make the decision to go test optional, you're going to want to see first if you can get a competitive SAT or ACT score. If you know for sure that your scores are not competitive, then you can try to go test optional. But like I said, historically, what we've seen based on applicants the last couple of application cycles is that the students who are getting the best results are those who have an unweighted 4.0 GPA, or maybe like 1B at most. If you have like 3, 4, or 5 Bs, it tends to not work as well, right? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Okay, so what do you need then? What kinds of scores would you need to be more competitive? So these days, if you're thinking of going test optional, you kind of don't want to be just at the average of what these tests, of what these schools report, simply because what we've seen these days is that the average SAT and ACT scores are creeping upward, because as people choose to not submit scores if they're lower, that means the people who are submitting scores are the ones who have much higher scores. So these days, the new average score is probably going to be closer to what we consider the 75th percentile scores, which is normally like the top 25%. That's going to be the new 50th percentile in the next 2, 3, 4 years, most likely. So if you want to estimate your chances for top schools, we typically say if you're aiming for like a top 10, top 15 school, you're probably going to want an SAT score that's like 1550 or above, or 35 or 36 on your SAT or on your ACTs. If you're aiming for schools in the next tier, 16 to 30 or so, you're going to still want scores in maybe like a 1500 range, or an ACT score that's at least a 33 to be competitive. Okay, and if you're aiming for schools in that 31 to 60 range, you should still have scores in the 1450 plus range for SAT, and about a 31 or higher on the ACT, right? So you would still want a pretty high test score if you're thinking of going to if you're going to submit your test scores. Okay, so if you do have questions for me that you want me to answer in the Q&A session, kindly go ahead and put it in the Q&A box, right? Just to make sure that I get to them in the order that you put them in there. If time permits, I can take a look at the chat box, but I'd rather just focus on answering your questions in one place. Okay, so next question. So what about AP test scores? Are they still important? Well, so AP test scores are still considered by many schools, but they're not necessarily viewed as admissions tests per se. In other words, there are people out there who are trying to sort of circulate this idea that AP test scores are somehow now going to be the new SAT subject tests, or they're going to be just as important as SAT or ACT for test blind schools. That's not necessarily true based on what I've been hearing from people in admissions. They're still going to look at AP testing the same way they've always looked at AP testing, which is really a way of contextualizing a student's transcript. So what we mean by this is that they use AP scores to help sort of validate or understand how students perform in their actual courses. So if a student got a 5 on an AP test but got a B on the course, getting a 5 might help a little bit, because it might suggest to the admissions office that, oh, you know what, this student might not have done as well for one reason or another, but the 5 in the AP suggests that they know the material pretty well, at least, right? On the other side of the spectrum, if a student got a 1 or a 2 on an AP exam, but they got an A in the class, it might suggest to the colleges that there might be some grade inflation going on. It might be that teachers are giving A's too easily, but not necessarily preparing their students. Okay, so yeah, so it still helps to necessarily get good AP test scores. Now, given the last couple of years, the AP tests have been kind of a little bit different. So like, I guess 3 test cycles ago, not this current one for May, but in May 2020, they had those AP exams that were basically only, what do you call this? They were like 45-minute online AP tests. So a lot of colleges feel like that doesn't necessarily give them a fair impression of a student's abilities. So AP tests, while still important, are not necessarily going to be weighted the same way as, let's say, for example, the SAT or ACT. Okay, so ultimately, yes, if you're getting an A in an AP class, you definitely want to go ahead and do the best you can on your AP exams. Okay, so a reminder once again, because I'm seeing a lot of people putting things in the chat, go ahead and put things into the Q&A box, please. Okay, all right. All right. So one of the key things that we think has made HS2 successful in the past is that we really do offer a lot of our students different ways to stand out.